Welcome back to Red Cedar Radar. Paul is joining me again on the pod to talk basketball this time. Our previous episode, we kind of gave a rundown on everything that's happened recently with the football program and the new staff. Now we're going to switch gears and talk basketball. Paul, what do you think about the basketball team so far, just off the top of your head?
Well, I think we've seen a pretty major shift over the last 3 weeks or so. And I forget exactly what the situation was the last time we recorded and talked about basketball, but I believe it was prior to the big win over Baylor. And maybe sometime around the time where the Spartans dropped the first two Big Ten games against Wisconsin and Nebraska. And so clearly things have taken a major shift in the positive direction since then. I think there's a lot of hand-wringing going on, before that big win over Baylor, with some good reason. I mean, because the team, frankly, looked bad. Those losses, especially to Nebraska, was pretty. That wasn't great. And anytime you have, I believe, 5 losses at the in December, that's usually not a good thing, even if you're playing a Tom Izzo level schedule. So that was a level for concern. Now, I was never super worried. Like I was getting worried. I don't know if I was quite too worried, but I wasn't worried yet. And I think, fortunately, as it has happened, 25 years in a row now, Izzo kind of worked some Izzo magic. The team kind of got their heads straight, or whatever else needed to happen. And they got a little healthier too. And since they've won 4 straight, so starting with that absolute thrashing of Baylor and Little Caesars Arena, which was a really fun game to watch, and you could argue one of the most impressive wins in the last, 10 and 20 years. I mean, just based on the opponent and the margin of victory, that was a very impressive win. I think I would almost personally have to go back to, and this may predate you a little bit, Sydney, I'm not sure, but the 2009 tournament run, MSU played Louisville. And Louisville was the number 1 overall seed in that tournament. And I thought MSU just physically dominated them. And by halfway, I've almost never seen a team literally give up. But that Louisville team gave up with 10 minutes to go. Mm. They're just like, we're done. And it was obvious. It was very obvious. And, that Baylor game was over in the first half. I mean, it really was. And that's a well-coached, good team. So that was nice to see. And then, of course, Spartans have had 3 good wins since then, including the one yesterday against Indiana State, which I believe you were there to cover. And
yes,
I was actually there as a fan for the first time in 4 years. So that was fun.
Yeah, I think going back to the Baylor game, obviously they dominated, but it just seemed like the morale of the team was way higher than it had been in previous games. It was a necessary win for the record, and for beating beating Baylor as that high level opponent, but it was very necessary, I think, for the locker room and the team as well, because I've seen a different team in those 3 wins since that game, just leadership wise, organizationally, being connected on the court. They, there's always going to be slips back into kind of that messy play that we saw at the beginning of the season, I think, with this team. But overall, I think it's on the up from here. That would be my prediction. Obviously, Big Ten play, and we'll talk about this, I think, too, but Big Ten play is a very different ball game. But I was very pleased yesterday with what I saw in the Indiana State game in the second half, when Indiana State kind of cut the lead a couple times, and every single time the Spartans were able to regroup and rally each time. And I felt like it was different guys doing different things in those rallies. It wasn't all on Tyson Walker's shoulders, which it had been previous to that Baylor win. AJ Hoggard kind of stepped up. We had a great tip from Jaden Akins. Even Trey Holloman, I think, drew a good foul at the end, drove into the lane and brought a spark. So it was different guys, and Malik Hall, different guys doing different things, which is necessary, especially because we can talk about this subject now. Jeremy Fears is going to be out for the rest of the season. So some of those other guys are going to need to step up a little bit more, because I always thought he was kind of a player that brought a little bit of a spark and a little bit of energy when needed, even though he is young. I think he's going to be a sorely missed going into Big Ten play. And Izzo kind of touched on that himself in the postgame presser yesterday as well. Any thoughts on that at all, Paul?
Yeah, I think just to touch on the Jeremy Fear situation, I'm sure that most people listening to this are probably aware, but he was
Mm.
when he was back at home after the Stony Brook game, which was a few days before Christmas, he went home to Joliet, Indiana, or Illinois. I'm sorry, Joliet, Illinois,
Hmm.
and by the accounts that we've heard, which is somewhat limited information, he was in a house party, basically, catching up with some old friends. It was about 3 or 4 in the morning. It sounded like the party was just kind of breaking up, and an unknown assailant in a ski mask came in and just started randomly shooting. He was hit in his leg, in his thigh. The bullet was lodged into his femur, and so it required surgery to remove the bullet. It was not life threatening. Apparently, it just barely missed an artery that would have been significantly more serious if it was like an inch to the right or to the left. Also, one of his companions, I guess there was I believe a 19-year-old woman that was also hit in the abdomen. It had or the pelvis. I think I heard both of those. I'm not sure which is correct. It was even said in one article, and I've only seen this one place, that Jeremy actually helped to kind of stop the bleeding for his friend that was
Mm.
also injured. So that just kind of shows you the type of person that he is, and how he responded to that type of crisis, which is consistent with what we've heard about him. I mean, we've heard that Jeremy is a Mateen Cleaves-esque leader, and Izzo has said that himself, and he does not throw that type of praise around lightly.
Yeah.
So yeah, it looks like he was at the game yesterday. He was on crutches, and I think that's a good thing. The team certainly didn't seem deflated by the situation. I mean, you never know emotionally how 18 to 22-year-old young people are going to respond to a situation like that, but it seems to be fine. And
Yeah.
I think, yeah, it's unlikely that he's going to return this year. I really have a hard time imagining that he'll play.
Yeah.
I've seen some speculation from some Michigan State folks that are in the that are in the medical field, which I am not, that suggest that they think there is a possibility that he could come back sooner. But I mean, what? I mean, the kid's on crutches now. Like, what kind of shape is he going to be in? It just
Yeah.
doesn't seem
Yeah.
likely. Um,
Something that I was happy to see yesterday when I was at the game, I don't know if you noticed this or not, but he would get up during timeouts, use his crutches to walk out into the huddle, every like almost every time.
mhm,
So and no boot or like anything like that, and so he's able to put like other than the crutches, the majority of his weight on that leg, which I feel like are both positive things that he's able to get up and move easily. I mean, timeouts happen fast. So you kind of got to be up and out there,
mhm.
um, which I thought those were positive things. Although I just don't. Why risk
Yeah.
coming back after that sort of injury? I mean, obviously, I know why he would want to come back,
Mhm.
obviously, but you know, I think he's going to be someone that Izzo goes to in the future. Like, obviously, that was the plan to bring him in this whole recruiting class to kind of take over for the veteran guys that will be leaving this year. So, why risk that in the future with coming
Yeah.
back too soon? And obviously, Izzo's smart with injuries, like we've seen already this season. Who is it? I can't think of their name, and I should know.
Jackson Kohler
Jackson
and
Kohler. That's
Garrick
embarrassing.
Norman, both in boots, but no longer in
Yeah,
boots.
yeah. And and Jackson Kohler was seen doing like what I want to say, like contact warm up
Mm,
before the game at Indiana State. So that's a huge plus, I feel like. But they
yeah.
were careful. They put the boot back on him when he was having soreness, didn't rush it. Now he's back out of the boot doing just warm up. So they're smart with that sort of stuff. So they'll know what's best for
Mhm.
Jeremy, but a very sad situation
Yeah.
overall.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully, of course, we all hope that he makes a full recovery. I mean,
Yeah,
there's no reason to expect that this is going to, impact his life outside of basketball. It seems like he'll make a full recovery as far as that goes. Now, hopefully, he'll be able to make a full kind of basketball recovery. I mean, you always
right.
worry with any type of serious injury that
Mhm.
there's going to be some level of athleticism that's lost. Um, you just never know how the body's going to recover. But I mean, he's a young person; he'll probably heal pretty quickly. And
Yeah,
it's not like he's Cohen Carr, for example, like that relying on his like 99th or
right.
99.9 percentile athleticism is a big part of his game.
Yeah,
He's a point guard, and he's smart, and he's a leader, and those things, a leg injury is not going to impact as much. But yeah, it's sad that he won't be able to see more time. I mean, Um, he wasn't contributing a lot from a scoring standpoint, but from an assist
Hmm.
standpoint and a leadership standpoint, which he can
Yeah.
still provide from the bench, and also from a just a defensive and assist standpoint, he was doing really well.
Hmm.
Um, I just wanted to note in that win over Oakland, he actually played a pretty interesting role in that game because Oakland was applying kind of a junk zone. It was hard to explain, and I guess I'm not as much of a basketball tactician to explain the details of it. But Oakland was playing a zone that gave the Spartans trouble in the first half of
Yeah.
that game, and that game was a little bit tight. I don't think the Spartans ever trailed in the game, but Oakland was giving them a little trouble, as Oakland does. I mean, that is a rivalry, and it's serious. Um, but by the second half, I think that Michigan State kind of figured it out. And part of what they were doing was actually using fears in the middle of the zone, which I mean, usually you don't see the point guard doing that. And I mean, the Spartans are blessed with quite a few good ball handlers this year, which is one of the reasons I think the ceiling for the team remains very high. But I thought that was quite interesting to see a freshman point guard, kind of dissecting the zone from the top of the free throw line. I mean, usually you have a power forward, somebody like Malik Hall or Draymond Green, that type of player, like a bigger player that's a good passer. You usually try to do that, but to do it with a 6'1" point guard is a little unusual, and he did really well. So that was one of the notable storylines from that game, and he was showing a lot of growth, and that's going to be curtailed now. But it's kind of what I hope to see, and I didn't notice this yesterday when I was in the stands. I was actually kind of behind the bench in the lower bowl, but up quite a few rows. Is if I were Izzo, I would park Fears right next to him. I would sit Fears on one side of Coach and just feed him, get like a heavy dose of coaching 101 of like, this is what I'm
Hmm.
doing, this is why I'm doing it, because I think that could really pay dividends later. Because I mean, this is the
Yeah.
guy that you want to be the coach on the floor going forward, and I think
Yeah.
he's got
Yeah.
every bit of capability to be a very high level. So as I say, park him next to Izzo, let him soak it all in.
Next time I see Izzo, I'll let him know that
Yeah,
what we
okay, do
think
that.
from here. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good plan.
Something that you kind of touched on a little bit with Oakland, was kind of the unique zone that they were running and how it kind of gave Michigan State a little bit of trouble. Izzo talked about how in the press conference yesterday, how many different types of teams they've seen so
Mm-hmm.
far going into Big Ten play and how valuable that has been. Sometimes I get a little bit scared by how the schedule is built and how like tremendous of, teams that we have to play or they have to play before they head into Big Ten time. But that's a really good point that he made. And I feel like it's been really good for this new mix of players. I know we have a lot of veterans, but I feel like he's running things a little bit different and he has a mix of some different guys out there that maybe didn't play too much time together last season. Um, I feel like that's going to be really valuable going into Big Ten play. I don't know that for sure, obviously, but he touched on it, and that was something I was kind of thinking of too. Although it was a daunting schedule, they are really battle tested at this point, heading into those really important, games.
Yeah,
Any
I totally
thoughts?
agree.
Yeah, sorry. Any thoughts about like the Big Ten schedule and how you think MSU will match up with some of those teams?
Yeah, sure. I think that as we sort of look forward to some of the Big Ten schedule, as you mentioned, playing different styles is always important. Although I don't think there's a lot of Big Ten teams that really play a lot of zone.
Right.
That
Hmm.
sort of comes and goes. But I mean, certainly by the time you get to the NCAA tournament, you
Right. They're
gotta
really
have
important then.
faced. I mean, it
Yeah.
just pays such dividends to because you just never know, especially that first round game. What kind of
Yeah.
team you're going to draw. And so having that experience of playing some different styles is certainly very important. And Izzo's always kind of prioritized that.
Yeah.
And I think it was also good leading up to the Big Ten season that Indiana State tested MSU a little bit in the second half
Hmm.
because when the wins over Baylor and in Oakland and especially over Stony Brook, basically by halftime those games are over.
Right.
And,
Right.
and Michigan State has struggled to close out close games. If we think of the James Madison loss, MSU had a lead late, let it get to overtime and lost. Michigan State was up on Arizona with 5 minutes to play and couldn't close it out. I think they were within shouting distance of Duke and couldn't close it out. And they had a lead at Nebraska late and they couldn't close it out. So when Indiana State actually took the lead yesterday, as we're recording this, it was yesterday.
Hmm.
And then Michigan State was able to kind of put like a 12-2 run on them, I believe is what it
Yeah.
was, and push that lead back to 10. I think that was very significant because they could have very easily had the same storyline play out, and it could have gone
Yep.
down to the wire like James Madison did.
Hmm.
Which I think, honestly, if you look at Ken Palm, this would back this up. Indiana State's a little better than James Madison, even though um, James Madison is undefeated and ranked, and Indiana State is not. On a neutral court, that would be a close game, and I think Indiana State would be favored. And I'll tell you, that team ran some good offense. They really
They
did.
did.
I
They
mean,
did. Yeah. There was a couple
wow.
times I was looking at the I don't know exactly what it's called. It's like the report where they show where all the shots went in.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like perfect around that three-point arc. Like they could not miss, and I also just thought that they played really well together. Like they just were a machine.
Mm-hmm.
There maybe there were a few times that guys weren't doing what they were supposed to do or whatever, but there wasn't a lot of that I noticed. They were really well oiled, which I was
Yeah.
impressed with.
Yeah. I mean, the way that they ran screens and picks and cuts,
Yeah.
and I mean, MSU really, I think, played very good defense yesterday because, I mean, Indiana State's been putting, I mean, they were one of the leaders of all Division One in offensive efficiency, and they were the
Yeah.
number one shooting team coming in
Yep.
effective field goal position. Not this top
Yeah.
five, number one, and they showed
Yeah.
why. So
Yeah. Seriously.
um,
Yeah.
they were good, and I will
Hmm.
say though, in the second half of that game, I think we did see Cohen Carr getting a little bit exposed on defense, and I'd have
Yeah.
to go back and check, but it looked like when the Sycamores had that big spurt right after halftime and took eventually, erased the 10-point deficit and took the lead. I think Cohen was kind of at the scene of the crime a few times on defense. Um, and he's a freshman, so
Hmm.
it is what it is. Like, it's a good
Yeah.
learning experience for him. But
Yeah.
I think Hall had to go back in. He had a little foul trouble, and then Hall had to go back in, and I don't think he came out after like the 12-minute mark or something.
Yeah. Well, I think Izzo even said, because someone brought up in the presser, no Booker, and he was like,
Mm-hmm.
we tried to get Booker in, but it just didn't work. And then they brought up Cohen Carr, and he was kind of like, well, he's a freshman. And we saw as a reminder that he is a freshman today, and just kind of left it at that. So, I mean, he's a spark. He's a fun player. I think he still needs some development,
Yeah.
obviously, because he is a freshman. And it's good to be reminded of that sometimes, because sometimes I get hyped up and I want him to dunk it all the time, and then I forget. Well, he has to go play defense too. So
Yeah.
yeah, both sides of the court, definitely.
And I think he's shown improvement. I think he's shown growth. He looks like he's a hard worker, and he's got a high level motor, and he has played
For sure.
good defense, which frankly is better than I expected so far. But he's a freshman. He's going to be inconsistent, and that's completely
Yeah.
understandable and to be expected. So
Yeah.
that's okay.
I feel like all of the freshmen are moldable,
Hmm.
and they're going to be, I mean, great. They are great players, but they're going to be great players under Izzo after they kind of let him use his, like you said, Izzo magic on them a little bit. They have great foundations, and I think they all fit in Izzo's scheme really well,
Hmm.
um, from what we've seen early in this season. So I'm
Yep.
excited about their trajectory this season, but then also in years to come, I think so.
Yep. Completely agree.
So Michigan State will take on Penn State on January 4th for the Izzone alumni game. I'll be there,
Oh,
being
nice.
an alumni in the stands. Any thoughts just on Penn State themselves?
Well, Penn State, I mean, they're right now, if you believe some of the metrics, they are the weakest team in the Big Ten.
Mm,
And
yeah,
so, being that that's a home game, that should be the easiest game left on MSU's schedule. So
yeah,
that 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 should be a W. Let's
yeah,
hope. I mean, of
yeah.
course, you can't really take any Big Ten game for granted, but
Of course.
um, that's kind of a nice way to get back into the Big Ten season, considering how the first two games went.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think that'll be good. But after that, things get really, really interesting, and I think that's where
Yeah.
we're going to really find out how good the Spartans really are, because after Penn State, there's a stretch of basically 6 games that I think will really tell us whether this team's a contender or not. And I think they still could be a contender in the Big Ten, although there's some challenges there that we'll probably touch on. But after Penn State, the 6-game gauntlet that basically takes us almost to the end of January is at Northwestern, followed by at Illinois, and
Mm-hmm.
then you got home against Rutgers and Minnesota, and those two teams they're kind of in the bottom. They're drifting to the bottom of the standings, so those games should be okay. But then you got a road game at Maryland and a road game at Wisconsin. So those are, those 3 road games are, basically four of the toughest 7 games left on the whole schedule. If you were to kind of rank them from easiest to hardest.
Yeah.
So, and right now MSU is projecting to be favored at Northwestern and at Maryland, and they're favored to be an underdog, or more likely to be an underdog, at Illinois and at Wisconsin. So,
Hmm.
I think in that next batch of 7 games, uh, you know, the Spartans need to come out of that with no more than 2 losses,
Yeah.
and so that would. And obviously the ones winning at Illinois is always hard, and I know they have a legal situation, so to speak, with one of their top players. Um,
Yeah.
that I've not. It didn't sound great to start with. I guess I'll just say that.
Yeah.
So I think they said he was actually arrested, which is usually not good. So we'll see how that impacts them. And of course, going to Wisconsin in the Kohl Center, although Michigan
Yeah.
State's played well there, honestly, the last few years. We've already seen that team beat us by 10 points once. So, um, those are going to be tough games. And any road game in the Big Ten is hard. So I think that's really going to tell us if this team can actually challenge for the Big Ten or not.
Yeah, I feel like that's my measure every year looking ahead to March. If they can do it on the road in the Big 10 against any of the opponents, because
Mm-hmm.
any opponent in the Big 10 on the road, like you said, is just hard. It's a tough game, tough environments. If they can make it out of some of those road games with nice quality wins, then I'm feeling much better going into March. If they struggle on the road but kind of win always at home, I'm a little more shaky, even if they look good, because they don't have those wins on the road. So January will be interesting to see how they can do, um, based on
Yeah.
them being on this uptick already. I'm curious.
Yeah. So I mean, if they, as I say, you can't lose more than 2, and that would
Yeah,
still put them at 5-4 because they're already in the hole in
right.
those first 9 games. So that'll be kind of a good benchmark to look at. Are they
Hmm.
are they at 5-4? If they're at 6-3, then I think you got something going. Then you can finish strong
Yeah,
because the back end of the schedule is not that bad.
you're right.
The stretch after the game at Wisconsin, um, there's a couple tough games in there. Clearly, I mean
Hmm.
they'll have they got Illinois again at home, and they got Michigan on the road. And Michigan,
Hmm.
you know, it's always going to be
They're a
tough to play
wild card.
Michigan. They're struggling. They're on the
Yeah,
struggle bus this year,
yeah.
but I mean that the Spartans should have probably won the last 2 in Chrysler and haven't got it done. So we'll see
Hmm.
if this year's any
Yep.
different. But the Spartans will be pretty heavily favored in that next group of I guess it's
Yeah,
8 games total. So that'll be when they can really start to make a run in the standings if they can, not pick up too many losses in January before.
yeah.
And then to end things out, you got at Purdue, which you never count at Purdue as a
Scary.
win, especially this
No.
year. So and unfortunately, Michigan State only gets Purdue once, and it is on the road.
Yeah,
So that's going to be tough. But then you end with Northwestern at home and Indiana on the road, and Indiana is not looking great. So,
yeah.
um, right now I did some preseason math to sort of go through some of these things. But actually MSU's strength of schedule, Big Ten schedule, is actually one of the softest in the conference overall.
Oh,
And with the two fairly challenging games already in the rearview mirror, in the Wisconsin and the road game at Nebraska, the remaining schedule is the easiest in the conference, and so
okay.
that's encouraging.
That
And we kind
is.
of went through the reason why. There's actually
Yeah.
only 3 games, the road games at Illinois, Wisconsin, and Purdue, that MSU is predicted to be an underdog. So if they win all the games they're favored in, that could be a final record of 15-5. I think everybody would be pretty happy with that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Now, will that happen? That's tough because you gotta,
Mm,
it's
yeah.
tough to win all those toss-ups. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. I don't know. I'm excited for January because I think they can really make some noise with some of those wins. And I didn't know that about the strength of schedule, as it compares. So that's really interesting. Um, and I hope that bodes well for them going forward because I think they might need it.
yeah, they should, and yeah, they definitely could use the help. It's kind of
Yeah.
a, I mean, I guess some fans would find this a cruel irony, but yeah, Michigan State's schedule is one of the easiest. Actually, the hardest Big Ten schedule goes to the Michigan Wolverines. Um, and if you're curious, it's actually worth about a game or a game and a half in the standings. So
Okay.
that's what the math tells me about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, Michigan's behind the eight ball now. They're going to have trouble making the postseason this year, I think. So
Yeah, I
we'll see.
wonder. We don't have to go too far on this tangent, but I'm curious if they'll stick with Jawan Howard going forward if things go south like they did last season. So
It
something to
it
watch.
does, yeah. It's be interesting to watch. It's hard to imagine if they in fact kind of continue on the same trajectory and they don't make the NCAA tournament again, and he continues to have some off the court issues, so to speak,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
them keeping him.
Hmm.
But strange things happen, and maybe they'll offer him a contract extension, Harbaugh esque.
Hmm.
Who knows? Never
Hmm.
know. Logic
Yeah,
doesn't
they
always
will
apply
keep him
down there.
forever. Yeah, yeah,
I'm okay with
yeah,
that.
yeah. Honestly, yeah. So I've kind of given a couple points about like what I've seen from the leadership standpoint and a couple of the players that I've been impressed with. But as far as like big picture stuff, what does the math say from your
Mm.
standpoint about
Well,
how
as
far
far as
MSU can go?
yeah,
Sorry.
I mean, as far as the Big Ten race goes itself, I mean, right now, as I said, MSU is actually they're projecting if you take all of the all the probabilities together, they're projecting with a final record of 12-8.
Okay.
So I mentioned they're going to be favored in a lot of those games, but a lot of them are toss ups. They're sort of on the
Mm-hmm.
positive side of the toss up, which means you're not going to likely you're going to drop one or two more.
Yeah.
So instead of 15-5, that's the sort of very optimistic look. 12-8 is kind of where they're projected to land, most likely. Now, Purdue, of course, is still ranked in they might are they number one? I haven't actually checked the
They
AP poll
are.
because the AP
Yep.
poll doesn't matter at all in basketball.
Number one.
Number one, good job, Boilers. Boiler up. Um, I did mention that I do have a degree from Purdue, right? I think I've mentioned that before, but anyway,
You
it's
have.
fine.
You have.
It's fine. Um, but yeah, Purdue is still projected as the top team. They're actually projected to finish around 16-4, and so that kind of tells you what the odds are. MSU's odds to win to actually be able to get up there to compete for a Big Ten title, because
Yeah.
most likely 16-4, maybe even 17-3 is going to be needed to win the Big Ten or to share the
Yeah.
title. And Michigan State's already got two losses, so
Mm-hmm.
it's still possible. I give the Spartans a 5% chance, 1 in 20, could be worse. If everything kind of breaks right, and that would mean Michigan State's got to, they got to make up for those two mulligans that they had early in the season, and maybe they probably are going to need to finish at least 15-5, if not 16-4, and have Purdue trip up a few times, which is
Yeah.
certainly possible.
Yeah. We've seen them trip up before.
We have, and and again, you're only one twisted ankle from Zach Edey
Yeah.
away from everything changing. And
Ugh.
I don't,
Yeah.
that's more just the reality of the situation than,
Right.
wishing an injury on a kid, which I would never do, of course. But,
Yeah.
that weird things happen.
Mm-hmm.
Kids get arrested in Champaign, for example. So,
Yeah.
things can happen. And speaking of Champaign, the sort of next two teams in line, Illinois and Wisconsin, are both looking at round 14-6 is what their record is projected at. They're both kind of neck and neck for that sort of second place in the Big Ten
Mm-hmm.
area. And then the Spartans are kind of even with Ohio State, kind of a projected record of around 12-8. So Ohio State's also blessed with a very easy schedule. I think their schedule is slightly easier than Michigan State's overall.
Okay.
Um, and even though Ohio State's they're not supposedly as good as Michigan State. If you look at the predictive rankings, Michigan State's around number 20 in Ken Palm. But that would be the other team that's kind of in Michigan State's tier right now. So, right now, if you project things out, the Spartans are most likely to land in that kind of cusp between having getting a double bye in the Big Ten tournament with a 4 seed, or
Mm.
possibly having to start one day earlier with the 5 seed, which is what
Yep.
or no, that MSU was a 4 seed last year, as I recall. So that's kind of where they sit. Now, the rest of the conference, honestly, no other team is predicted to really finish with more than above 500 in the league, with like Northwestern and Nebraska and Iowa are kind of that next tier.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't think it's the type of year where you're going to see a team that doesn't get to 500 make the NCAA tournament in Big Ten play. So we could only
Yeah.
be seeing 5 Big Ten teams in the NCAA tournament this year.
Okay.
So,
Interesting.
Yeah, that'd be my pick right now. I haven't looked at the bracketology because, again, bracketology in December doesn't matter. It does not
Yeah.
matter. There's been a lot of fun, banter with Seth Davis on Twitter about like trying to defend MSU and how they should be ranked, and it's like, Seth, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm,
It
mm-hmm.
doesn't. So let's not freak out about that. So anyway, it's all just for fun this time of year until the stuff gets real, maybe in February. Early
Yeah.
February is when you start looking at bracketology because that's when it actually starts to matter a little bit. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, so that's where their things are projecting now. I think a fourth or fifth place finish is most likely. Um, um, but that's why they play the game. So hopefully the Spartans can kind of win a few more of those toss-ups than they could potentially lose.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm feeling much more confident about that now than I would have 4 games ago. 4 games ago, I would have said we're going to lose all of those toss ups because we're not organized. We don't really have a leader. We don't really know what's going on. We lose the ball all the time, can't make shots. Tyson Walker is exhausted from carrying everyone on his back. And
Mm-hmm.
now, I mean, Tyson can miss a couple shots and it's okay. Not that I
Mm-hmm.
want him to miss a couple shots, but I feel like that lets him play a little more easy breezy and he can feel like he can pass the ball around a little bit more. And I don't know. I just noticed yesterday in the Indiana State game that he just seemed a little more at ease on the court. It wasn't all got to make the shot, or we're gonna lose. Like it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't all pressure all the time. So I'm feeling optimistic about going into Big Ten play. The numbers, I guess, kind of go along with that as well with what we've seen. Um, and I just here's my question. Why do you think they started off so slow? What was the problem? Do you have
Um,
any?
I think it was a combination of a few things. And I think Tyson Walker was a little dinged up, and then he got the flu,
Mm,
and
hmm.
Malik Hall had the flu. So you had a
Yeah.
couple guys that were not quite at 100%. And then you had, A.J. Hogard, bless his soul, is a bit
Hmm.
inconsistent still. And when he
Yeah.
is not kind of fully locked in, then that's a problem. And since to his credit, since the Baylor game, he has been.
Yep.
And the difference in the team between the sort of good version of AJ and the sort of average version of AJ is pretty significant.
Yep.
Especially
Yep.
when you have Walker and Hall not really up to playing to their potential either.
Right.
And then you have Jaden Akins, who again had a tough start to the year shooting wise. He seemed a little bit
Hmm.
frustrated, and that can carry over. I think one thing Izzo mentioned after the Stony Brook game is that in some of those losses, the bad shooting was getting into their heads and it was starting to impact their defense. And that seems to be what happened in both the Wisconsin and the Nebraska losses. Is that you just
Yeah.
they had lost that their confidence got a little rocked and they
Hmm.
weren't quite healthy and just it wasn't quite fitting together.
Yep.
And when you're with the players that we had just mentioned, Walker, Akins, Hogard, Hall, those are your four best players. And when
Right.
none of them are really playing to their potential, your team's not
Yeah.
very good. Like it's just any team in the country, if you take your top four players and they're kind of playing just mediocre versions of themselves, you're just not
Yeah.
a good team at that point. So
Right.
now that they're sort of back to playing closer to their ceiling, then you see what this team can be.
Yeah.
Um, and I think this team still has the potential to do some pretty good things in March. Um, and I mean that remains to be seen, but
Yeah.
um, there are some positive signs there.
I think because they started so highly ranked at the beginning of the season, then a couple of those things happened. I mean, I can't imagine how low morale was because you have all this hype around you,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, a couple guys get sick. Things don't go the way that they're supposed to. I can't imagine how much that brings down the team. So I bet it took a couple games for that to kind of build back up. Uh, and what you mentioned about AJ Hogard being consistent is, in my opinion, the key to all of this. Like, he needs to be consistent. He is so capable of being consistent and being a leader. And we've seen it. We saw it in Indiana State just yesterday, and
Mm-hmm.
that needs to carry over into Big Ten play like desperately. I last year I even said when he's not consistent, they don't play well. And I was hoping this year that him being, much more mature, had been is a veteran, it had been a leader, is now a leader again, that he would be more consistent, and maybe it just took a little bit at the beginning of the season to find that stride. But I'm going to be fingers crossing for the rest of the season that he can keep that, because I think he is the key to everything, which is
Yep.
maybe scary. But
I completely agree. I mean, uh, the difference between this team being, kind of a, NCAA tournament team that can threaten for the Sweet 16 to a
mm-hmm.
team that can make the Final Four and threaten for the national title is a fully engaged AJ Hogarth, as well
Yes.
as, and to some extent, Malik Hall, who's also been a struggle with inconsistency in his career.
Mm-hmm.
And he's been, I think, when he doesn't have the flu, he's been pretty
Right.
consistent. But those two guys need to be consistent. And then Akins
Mm-hmm.
and Walker, I think, will sort of follow. Those guys are going to be, I think, okay. Especially Walker is
Yeah.
going to be,
Yeah. Yeah.
when Walker's on, he's a stone cold killer. I mean, let's be
Oh
honest.
yeah.
There's just, you
Oh
can
yeah.
see when he has the ball, it's like, oh, he's going to score right now, and no one can
Yep.
stop him. And that's just the way
Yep.
it is.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Seriously. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, you can just see it. But as far as some of the big picture stuff I just mentioned, I've always been high on this roster just because of the way it's
Mm-hmm.
constructed. And
Yeah.
anytime you have the kind of senior guard play and a lot of high level ball handlers, which, I mean, let's be honest, in the guard rotation, almost everybody can play the point at this point. No pun intended. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's a powerful thing. And that's one thing that you'll see in looking at some of the kind of statistical breakdown of this team, is that they're actually very good with turnovers relative to past Izzo teams.
Yeah.
They're not turning the ball over. I mean, that's been a storyline for decades, right? Like, Izzo teams turn the ball over too much. That's
Mm-hmm.
not happening this year. They're also creating more turnovers than usual. And so that gives me optimism for kind of the future.
Yep.
And shooting is starting to come around. I mean, MSU's shooting defense has been very strong. The effective field goal percentage defense has been very strong, and I think the offensive numbers have started to improve. Those, of course, started kind of miserable, as some of the 3-point shooting, especially, was just abnormally poor. But you did kind of assume that that would turn around, because these are players that have all shown that they can, hit about 40% from three, and
Yeah.
more like 75% of their free throws, which they were below that. So that's starting to turn around, which it's sort of regressing to the mean. I mean, it just doesn't make sense for a player to become go from a 40% shooter to a 30% over an off season if there's no injury. It doesn't make any sense. So that's encouraging. As far as some of the weaknesses of the team, though, rebounding still is a concern. I think in both offensive and defensive rebounding, Michigan State's kind of the lower end of the Big Ten, like in the double digits ranking wise, which is never good for a Tom Izzo
Mm-mm.
team. And that's one thing, actually, after the Stony Brook game, the question I wanted to ask Tom Izzo, but I kind of chickened out because he basically answered it right before I was going to ask it, is if there was one thing that Izzo could ask Santa for, what would it be? And I think the answer would be better rebounding, because that's still a bit of a problem. And even some of the mediocre rebounding teams we've faced, the Spartans have not really lit it up. And so
Yep.
that's a concern. And then the other kind of weird weakness is this team's not getting to the free throw line very much, which is, the number of free throws per field goal attempt is pretty low. And I think they're also fouling a little bit more than average compared to other Big Ten teams. So especially with a team that does get downhill quite a bit. I mean, think about the number of drives that
Yeah.
Hogarth and Walker have to the basket. That
Yeah.
doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Although maybe some of it's just post play is a little weaker than, I'm sure that, Zach Edey gets way more free throw attempts than, say, Matty Sissoko
Yeah.
does. So maybe that's the answer. But that is kind of the statistical breakdown of where this Michigan State team sits. But from a big picture standpoint, what I like to look at some of the individual components of KenPom efficiencies to get a feel for where this team is. And if you look at kind of the offensive efficiency and the defensive efficiency, this team actually is already projecting to be a little better than the team ever was at any point last year, which I think is pretty
That's good.
encouraging.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of the metrics, especially, you can look at is there are certain basically attributes of past national champions that are basically almost always true. And one of the rough rules of thumb, and this is somewhat approximate, is that a team has to be in the top 40 in both offensive and defensive efficiency. And I think every national champion back, like, since 2002, when these numbers were readily available, that's true. And right now there are 20 total teams that fit that criteria, and Michigan State is one of them. So if from that standpoint, is Michigan State still a national title contender? I would have to say yes. and it would be still there. There's kind of like a core zone, and there's like a sort of periphery zone, and the Spartans are still kind of in that periphery zone.
Yeah.
But that's encouraging. I mean, there's been other Tom Izzo teams that have done very well in March that have a very similar statistical profile to what they have now. Like the 2010 Final Four team, it looks very similar to this year's
Okay.
team. So, um, so that's some things to give you some hope.
Yeah,
Now, there's also
definitely.
several other Big Ten teams in that category. Wisconsin, Illinois, and Purdue are also national title contenders for that same reason. You could argue.
Yeah.
Um, Now, typically, you need to get into the top 6 overall of Ken Pom to really be a national title contender. And MSU is not quite there yet. Could they get there? Possibly. Um, but that's kind of one other thing to keep an eye out for. But MSU is ranked number 20 in Ken Pom, and that's still pretty good. So
Yeah. Yeah.
we'll see where this takes them.
Like I've said a couple times, I'm feeling really optimistic just based off these last couple games going into Big Ten play. I'm kind of excited. Before, I maybe wasn't excited to watch the games just because things were kind of feeling like they were falling apart. And
Mm-hmm.
after having a football season that completely fell apart, I couldn't handle basketball falling apart too. So I've been pleasantly surprised, pleasant or pleased, I guess, with how they've been doing, and I'm excited to see them play their Big Ten season because that's when things get most exciting. Like we've touched on away games and different things. Anything else that you want to say about basketball?
I'll just say that it was one of the exciting moments over the last couple of weeks was in the Stony Brook game when Nick Sanders hit a 3-pointer. I don't know if
Yes.
you
Yeah.
were at that game,
Mm-hmm.
Sydney, but
Mm-hmm.
that was pretty cool to see. I think, obviously when
It
you're up
was.
40 points on a team, it's a good time for the walk-ons to start, filling the stat sheet. And
Yep.
a lot of folks wanted to see Tom Izzo hit a shot, obviously, but I believe Izzo actually got the assist to Nick Sanders, who
He
buried a
did.
three.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was pretty cool. I guess David Harns had a chance to interview Barry Sanders outside the locker room, which
Mm-hmm.
we were all wondering where he was because I was covering that game, and Ryan and I were sitting in the press room like, where did David go? But apparently he
Mm.
was, interviewing an NFL legend, so good
No
on
big
him.
deal. Yeah.
No big deal.
Yeah.
But that was pretty cool. But I actually had a chance to
It
talk
was.
to Nick in the preseason. MSU had their kind of on campus media day, and
Mm-hmm.
I had uh, you know carved some time out of my schedule to attend that. And they basically brought out all of the players, like every single player, all the walk-ons, everybody. And the members of the media got maybe 30, 45 minutes to talk to each of them, and they kind of rotated through. And
Mm-hmm.
at some point, I went up talking to Nick, and I'm just like sitting at a table, just like right in front of him, just like asking him
Mm-hmm.
questions. And he's a nice young man, so it was good to kind of talk
Yeah.
to him. I believe he said he's I don't want to say a concert pianist, but I believe he can play the piano
Oh,
actually quite well, which I think was kind of fun
interesting.
to learn. So
That is cool.
it's one of the perks of this job, so to speak, or this hobby, whatever you want to call it, is you get to meet some of these kids, face to face, and get to know them as people a little bit, which is fun.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's really is quite
And I
fun.
think important
Yeah.
because a lot of people don't remember that they are kids and they
Yep.
are people. So it's a good reminder for me sometimes as well.
Mm.
I saw after he made that bucket that he latched onto that basketball and was not going to let it go. And I think he gave a quote about, what are you going to do with the ball? And he said, I'm going to keep it forever or something, which I thought was super
Absolutely.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Paul. Well, thank you so, so much for joining and talking about MSU basketball, one of my favorite things to do. Michigan State will be taking on Penn State at the Breslin on January 4th at 7 p.m. And the game's on Peacock, which I'm not really a fan of, but that's neither here nor there, I guess. They didn't ask my opinion. But check that game out on Peacock and check out our coverage of the game at Spartans Illustrated. So subscribe to our site for football and basketball coverage. We do a lot of great stuff, and our team kind of pumps out articles 24/7, basically. Keeps everyone up to date on anything Michigan State athletics related. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spartans Illustrated, and find this podcast on YouTube or anywhere that you listen, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, lots of options. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will see you all again shortly. Have a very happy new year, and probably by the time this is out, it will be 2024. So, get those New Year's resolutions going, and I will see you all again shortly. Thanks so much for joining, Paul. Bye.
No problem. Anytime, Sydney.